Hi, so this is one I've wanted to make for a little while now. It's about history, which is a subject that always interests me, and it's something that I think is worth a little bit of reflection, discussion. And I'm going to ask an open question, which is, if there was to be one individual more than any other who is seen as a founding father of Britain, who would that person be? That's not an easy question to answer in the case of this island. And I specifically say this island as opposed to this country because some of the people I have in mind go beyond, certainly beyond the United Kingdom, but even further back than the kingdoms of England and Scotland when they were unified in the 10th century. Um, but if we look at other countries around the world, it's quite clear to point to a founding father. I'm in the United States, of course, you have George Washington. Germany, Otto von Bismarck, the modern German Republic, that is, or modern Germany, let's say. China, there's several figures. There's the Han Emperor Qin Shi Huang. Of course, Chinese history goes beyond that, but he is largely seen as cementing Han supremacy at that time and making China a lot larger. In Chinese mythology, there's the Yellow Emperor, but he probably never existed as a historic figure. And then, of course, later on, Sun Zhongshan, who was the founder of the Chinese Republic, and then, of course, Mao, who founded the Communist People's Republic of China. Then France, there's Charlemagne, um, who's a very important figure for the Franks and kind of that Frankish, later French identity. Um, so with other countries, it's quite straightforward. Now, with Britain, it's not. Um, I think that the figure that most comes to my mind is most likely a mythical figure, and that is King Arthur. I've been reading this book over the. I'm a very slow reader because I balance out a lot of books at once. But I've been reading this book, Arthur and the Lost Kingdoms by Alistair Moffat. Now, most of the Arthurian connections tend to go to the southwest of England around Cornwall, but this focuses more on the Scottish lowlands, which is a part of the country I know fairly well. My parents live in Dumfries and Galloway. The book's very academic. It very much gets into etymology, name places, and so on, and the land. It's it's interesting enough. It doesn't get into anything to do with Guinevere or Merlin or anything like that. It's more to do with the etymology of place names and how important that was to the cultures that lived in them. It's quite a good book, quite a good read, but a little complex at points. You need to sort of because it really gets into the academic side of the etymology. But Arthur immediately comes to mind because Arthur is the central figure of the matter of Britain. You have the matter of France, and I believe there's the matter of Rome as well, which were kind of European mythological cycles, so to speak. Uh, Very much focusing on not so much national identity, more peoples, I would say. It's worth bearing in mind, though, that it's very likely that there was an Arthurian type figure. Um, so I think Arthur, in the sense that we know, Camelot, the Knights of the Round Table, and all of that, it is certainly mythical. But I do think there was probably a Romano-British figure who led a sort of resistance against Saxon invasions during the Heptarchy, which is kind of anachronistically called Dark Ages. Um, that was a very significant period in their history because the Western Roman Empire had collapsed. Rome could no longer fund outposts like Britain, and so it basically crumbled away. So you had that period of the 6th century, 7th century, 8th century, well, let's say between the 5th century and the 6th century, probably, um, where there is a lot of question marks, and there is, we don't know that much about the period, but there are a lot of interesting question marks. That's why I like the Clive Owen version of King Arthur because it's one of the very few adaptations that focuses on a much earlier period rather than the familiar sort of medieval knight in shining armor. This is really proto-Roman. It's an interesting film. I've always liked it, and I think it's underrated. Um, because it kind of shows that the Arthurian legend came about more by accident. If you watch the film, you'll see what I mean. I'd recommend it. Beautiful soundtrack as well. So I mentioned Arthur. I mean, I think Arthur's more like a personification of a sort of he wasn't Roman, he wasn't a native Briton, but sort of a character who was straddling somewhere between the two worlds. Um, there was a figure called Merfyn Wilt, who was a sort of druid, but who lived significantly later. Um, a few years ago, I watched a documentary on the 2012 prophecies, and I'm not getting into conspiracy theory territory here, but they mentioned this character, Merfyn Wilt, who most likely was the inspiration for Merlin. Then you got people like Geoffrey of Monmouth, who today is widely dismissed. Nevertheless, because his Historiae Britannium and his History of the Kings of Britain is largely um, yeah, it's full of mistakes in terms of the time frame. But nevertheless, over the centuries, Arthurian legend has become deeply ingrained in the British psyche. The original Britons actually moved westwards to what is now Wales. And the English, of course, are descended from Anglo-Saxons and Jutes and Angles. We are a diverse nation by definition. But looking at historic figures, in the case of England, of course, Alfred the Great was the first Wessex monarch who really unified England. Offa, during the Mercian supremacy, managed to unify the whole of the south of England. But really, it was Alfred. That's why he has the epithet of the Great, who did unify England around well, actually, his reign ended in 899, but certainly getting into his successors, England was largely unified. And in Scotland, what was old Pictish territory, Pict wasn't a word they used themselves, of course, it was Kenneth MacAlpin. England and Scotland unified actually roughly around the same time in the early 10th century. So they would certainly be perhaps the founding fathers, respectively, of England and Scotland. Wales, I would suggest perhaps Llewellyn ap Griffith, um, not as a founding father, but as a central figure. He was the last native-born Welsh prince, of course. Northern Ireland's a new province that only was created in 1922. Edward Carson, I guess, as the first prime minister, but it doesn't really have a founding father in the same way. Um, so it's an interesting question. Who is the founding father of Britain? Indeed, maybe we have a founding mother. Maybe Boudicca, Boudicca, to give her her Latinized name, could be one possible example. She, of course, led resistance to Roman rule. Um, there's other mythological figures like King Leir, um, but it's an interesting question. In England, of course, the mythology of Robin Hood. That's for a whole other video. Let me know your thoughts.